I do want to go ahead then and jump right into it and introduce our speaker. Up in the corner, you see Mr. Dale Jenkins. He's a companion of the New York Commandery, and he's the author of Diplomats and Admirals, Pearl Harbor Before, During, and After the War. Dale is a former U.S. naval officer who served on a destroyer in the Pacific and for a time was home-ported in Yokosuka, Japan. While on active duty, he was awarded the Navy Expeditionary Medal. His business career was primarily in international banking, and he also was a staff director at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. Dale currently serves on the Samuel Eliot Morrison Committee of the Naval Order of the United States at the New York Commandery that presents annually the most prestigious award for the best current history of the U.S. Sea Services. He's a regional director for the Naval War College Foundation. He has degrees in history and business from Harvard and Columbia. So without any further ado, I'd also like to welcome Letitia King. Letitia is Dale's assistant, and she'll be joining us for this presentation as well. So again, thank you all for being here, and let me turn it over to Dale. Dale.
Well, thanks very much. It's a real pleasure and a real honor to be talking to the Naval Order. There are many organizations that are associated with the Navy that do great work. But as I said to my New York group about 2 weeks ago, I consider the Naval Order home base because they do in-depth work, they do research, they do historical citations, and real understanding comes from this association. So I'm very glad to be part of it and glad to be able to contribute something tonight. About 2 weeks ago, and I think I mentioned this a few minutes ago, I attended a conference at Annapolis that was on the association, communication, coordination between the armed services and the State Department. And this is what's necessary to get quality foreign relations for the United States. One without the other, we see what happens when things go wrong. I also want to touch on the background of December 7th. Most of us know the story reasonably well, but there are some aspects leading up to it, which are important to understand, and I want to touch on that as well. And to do that, I want to start with some background on Japan and then work up to where we were in 1940 and 41. The Japanese were aggressive even in the 19th century. They were looking for commodities, for oil, for expansion, and it resulted in a war with China, the Sino-Japanese War in 1895. As a result of that, Japan took over Taiwan. And right here, it started up in here in the Yellow Sea, involved Taiwan here. And as a result of this war, Japan took over Taiwan. And it's interesting in the current context of claims by the current government of China. They've not controlled Taiwan since 1895. Right. And that was long before their current administration. Something to keep in mind when they are making their demands. Here's a ship of that, of the battles that went on then. Japanese man-of-war, steel-hulled, looks like 6-inch guns, coal-fueled, and under-fired. And here's their battle line going back. I took this photograph, I believe, of all places, in a museum in Florida. Going back to the map, in 1905, the war with Russia broke out. Again, it was over this peninsula up in the Yellow Sea, where Japanese beat the Russians, and the Russians sent their Baltic fleet 18,000 miles around the entire landmass of Eurasia, met the Japanese in this area here, the Tsushima Strait, and the Japanese sank them. And did not just won the battle, but sank just about all their ships. At that point, Japan was recognized as a major sea power. 1910, they took over all of Korea. And when the Great War broke out, later became known as World War I, Japan came in on the Allied side, and when it was all over, they took over the German colonies in the Pacific, the Marshalls, the Marianas, and the Carolines. After the war, there were naval treaties, 1921, 1930, in Washington and London. The result of that was that Britain and the United States had a 5-5 ratio, and the Japanese were given a 3 ratio. They weren't too happy with that, and they decided that they were going to make the most of their 3s, and they started building the most modern ships, the best torpedoes, and they got into aircraft early on. 1931, they moved into Manchuria, up in here, and 1933, because there were protests about that, they withdrew from the League of Nations. 1935, the treaties that were formed in Washington and London, they elected not to continue. And so that meant the end of the 5-5-3 ratio, and Japan started building a navy in a very big way. A lot of people in Japan thought that they got to just stick with what they had. They had a nice little empire, so to speak, but there were other elements that were too aggressive. In 1937, they invaded the northeast coast of China. So that was, the Japanese were on the move. Now, on the other side of the world, Franklin D. Roosevelt was increasingly concerned about war, not so much with Japan, but with Nazi Germany. This was our major focus of his attention, and actually continued to be his major focus. As we know, 1938, Hitler acquired additional territories, Austria, so forth. And 1939, he made his deal with Stalin to divide up Poland. Now, that's significant to us because this gave rise to the Naval Expansion Act. When Hitler came around through the Low Countries and into France, it gave rise to the Naval Expansion Act of 1940. There had been a lot of protest about any military expansion because of the isolationists, as they're known. They didn't want to be involved in another war in Europe. We were never threatened, and we lost a lot of men. But the threat of Hitler in France was enough to get the Naval Expansion Act approved. And this was going to provide for 18 carriers, over 100 destroyers, 43 submarines, and 15,000 aircraft. But it was going to be at least 2 years before any of those ships were in the fleet. And the Japanese had a 5-year gain on us as far as shipbuilding was concerned. Later in 1940, the War Council was formed as the threat of war became more apparent. And this consisted of Secretary of State Cordell Hull, Secretary of War Henry Stimson, Secretary of the Navy Frank Knotts, and Harold Ickes, who was not involved directly in foreign affairs, but was considered a smart guy and was included in that group. Later in 1940, Japan was invited, quote unquote, to go into the northern half of Indochina by the Vichy government, which was pro-German and was still claimed that they controlled all of France and all of the French colonies. So Japan was invited in, and they moved into the northern half of Indochina. About the same time, the US fleet, which we've been doing, carrying out exercises every summer, every year by year since 1920, they gradually became larger and larger, more complex, introduced aircraft year by year. They ended up in Pearl Harbor in 1940. And the War Council, Cordell Hull and the others, decided it would be a good idea if they stayed in Pearl Harbor. James Richardson, Admiral James Richardson, was opposed to this. He thought that, first of all, Pearl Harbor didn't have the facilities. It did have a dry dock. It did have a submarine base, but it did not have comprehensive facilities. And he thought that the fleet was better serviced if they stayed on the West Coast. He also thought that a fleet exercise, only from 150 miles out, but even so, it showed that Pearl Harbor could be vulnerable to attack. And he thought that instead of it being a deterrent to Japan, it was possibly a risk. Admiral Richardson went back to Washington twice to protest this decision. And when it was all over, he was relieved by husband Kimmel, who was there right through the rest of 1940 and into 41. At the same time that this was all happening, Japan entered into the tripartite pact with Germany. This was somewhat in retaliation or to compensate them for the fact that Hitler had formed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Russia. The Russians were still smarting over their loss in 1905, and Japan felt that they were vulnerable to the Russians without some alliance with somebody else, and that turned out to be Germany. Now, in 1941, there was another admiral that was very concerned with what was going on in Pearl Harbor, and that was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. Yamamoto was commander of the combined fleet of Japan. All the battleships, carriers, cruisers, destroyers, essentially the entire offensive fleet of Japan. He was not in favor of war with the United States. He had studied in the United States. He had been naval attaché in the United States. He did not think that Japan could win a war against the United States because our industrial capacity was 10 times what's Japan. He didn't see a way that they could possibly overcome that. In the long run, they would lose. However, he was concerned about the Army, the hotheads, the people that wanted to fight no matter what. And it was entirely possible that a war would result. So what does he do? He has to prepare his fleet for war, even if he doesn't want the war. Looking at the situation in Pearl Harbor, he realized that if there's going to be a war with the United States, there's only one way to win, and that is you got to win on the first day. And that meant a massive attack on Pearl Harbor that would destroy the fleet, destroy the base, and force what was left of the US fleet back to the West Coast. If that happened, there was the opportunity to then divide the Pacific Ocean, the US on the western part, Japan on the eastern part, and that was the game plan that he had. In June of 41, while Yamamoto was starting to train his ships, his planes, pilots, Germany invaded Russia. He double-crossed his partner, Stalin. And Japan, in response to that, took over the southern half of Indochina. In reaction to that, the British were very upset. This put the Japanese within air range of their base in Singapore, and they were very worried. And that transmitted to the US. And Roosevelt decided he was going to put an embargo on oil, in other words, to stop any financial transactions with Japan, and that prevented them from paying for any oil. And this was a serious thing for Japan because they imported 90% of their oil. And most of that, 80 to 90% of that, came from the United States. And Roosevelt also prevailed on the Dutch and the Dutch East Indies, which had a deposit of oil, and anybody else to also go along with this embargo. This was an asset freeze that Roosevelt wanted to make as a bargaining chip. In other words, if the Japanese would pull out of southern Indochina, he'd resume some flow of oil. If they didn't, he'd tighten it up again. It was going to be back and forth like a carrot and a stick. He went off to the meet with Churchill south of Newfoundland in a conference that was to become known as the Atlantic Conference. And while he was gone, Dean Acheson, Assistant Secretary of State, put a total freeze on the oil. He thought that the way to beat the Japanese was just to hit them with a stick, no carrot. And this really caused a crisis in Japan. They had a fair amount of oil stockpiled, but every day they were running through their stockpile of oil. And they thought that in the long run, they'd be strangled. So something had to happen. The Prime Minister of Japan, Prince Kanoe, he was a prince because he belonged to this family that could trace their lineage back 1,400 years. He decided that the way to break this was to have a summit meeting with Roosevelt. And going through our ambassador in Japan, Joseph Grew, who was very friendly with Roosevelt, he arranged tentatively to have this summit meeting with Roosevelt. And they agreed that September 21 to 23, they would meet in Juneau, Alaska. And Kanoe thought that if he could talk one-on-one with Roosevelt, he'd be able to end run these hot-headed generals and bring about a solution to this crisis. Well, Cordell Hull and the others in the War Council thought this was a terrible idea. Henry Stimson thought that Roosevelt would give too much away. Cordell Hull said, this isn't the way you do things. You have junior ministers, shape the different issues, and they resolve as much as they can, and then it goes to the senior heads of state, and they all actually, sign off on what's been agreed. Cordell Hull also said to Roosevelt, look, Kanoe cannot control the army. Whatever he might agree to when you meet with him, he won't be able to enforce. And so as a result of all that, the meeting in Juneau, Alaska never occurred. And Ambassador Grew, in his memoirs, said that this was a major turning point. Had that meeting occurred, it's quite likely that war could have been avoided. So as a result of this meeting falling through, which was a huge embarrassment to Hanoi, he was forced out of office. And General Tojo took over. Tojo, of course, far more powerful with the military, but nobody expected there was going to be much of a change. Soon after Tojo took office, there was a meeting with an entity called the Total War Institute. The Total War Institute was a group of 36 medium-level officers of the various departments in the Japanese government. 36, all but 4 were civilians, 2 from the Army, 2 from the Navy, and the rest were, all the other departments. They had spent about 2 months analyzing whether Japan could win a war against the United States. They researched all of the resources that Japan had, their industrial capability. They visited armed services bases. They visited Yamamoto and his flagship. They were just making an endless study. And they came back to the government with their report. The report was not an hour and a half. They spent 2 days reviewing everything they had done, every source of information, all their methods of analysis. They reviewed their visits to armed services bases, and they presented their conclusion that Japan cannot win against the United States. Tojo sat there for 2 days taking notes, and he became convinced Japan cannot win against the United States. So he then started to accelerate diplomatic relationships with his diplomats in Washington. And what had happened in Washington was that they started taking the position that they would delay. They would delay until their naval buildup started taking more effect. And they would also be manufacturing B-17s that they would fly to the Philippines along with, they were shooting for 75 B-17s and 200 P-40 escorts. And B-17s could cover everything from the Philippines up to the latest models could reach the southernmost islands of Japan and everything around it, in Taiwan, in China, wherever the Japanese were, the B-17s could reach, and this was a real threat. So the Japanese knew this was happening. They had sources of information, and they could see that as time went by, their advantage would be dissipated. And so they said, we've got to have a diplomatic solution, and we've got to have a deadline. And if the deadline isn't, if we don't have a diplomatic solution by the time the deadline is reached, then we have to have war, because eventually we'd lose anyway. And there were people that said, we would rather, and this is an insight into Japanese mentality, we would rather fight a war and lose than suffer slow strangulation. And so this was the offsetting positions as 1941 moved along. I'm sorry, I'm making, this whole thing is so sensitive. I'm trying to get the proper slide here. Here is Tojo. Now, Tojo and his foreign minister went to a retired diplomat. His name was Caruso. Caruso had spent his whole life in the Japanese Foreign Service. He spoke completely fluent English. And his last posting prior to his retirement was in Germany. And he had to sign the tripartite pact with Germany, even though he was opposed to it. and he had to be photographed standing next to Hitler. And that was something that was going to be a problem when he went to Washington to try to negotiate with Cordell Hull. But anyway, Caruso was told he had to leave immediately, like within 24 hours. And they held up the eastbound Pan Am Clipper for a day in order for him to make the flight. He got to Washington the shortest possible time. And here he is. Here's Cordell Hull with his Hamburg. Here is Nomura, the existing ambassador. And here is Caruso. And they're going to talk to Roosevelt. Tojo convinces the army they've got to withdraw from southern Indochina. And so that, with that as a bargaining chip, they present a proposal. We'll withdraw from southern Indochina if you give us a supply of oil. There were some other things in it, like, you know, what we do about China. China was getting to be a quagmire. They're all bogged down there. You know, that was part of it. But the essential elements was get out of Indochina, give us oil. That was submitted on November the 20th, 1941. Cordell Hull thought about this and drafted a counter proposal which said, we'll give you the oil for civilian use only. Well, civilian use only was better than no oil at all. And meanwhile, of course, the Japanese did have a stockpile. It was quite likely they would have accepted that. But Cordell Hull felt that he had to circulate that draft agreement around to our allies, the Dutch, for the Dutch East Indies, and they had been overrun in Europe, so they were a government in exile operating out of London, the British, and the Chinese. The Dutch came back and said, well, okay, it looks all right to us because, you know, we're in the crosshairs of any Japanese invasion again, you know, in our Dutch East Indies, so we'd like to avoid that. The British were hesitant. They thought a one-on-one agreement with between Japan and the US might leave them exposed at Singapore. So they might be, they were hesitant. But Churchill said, well, you know, think about the Chinese in this. And, you know, they thought that certain stipulations ought to be met before the whole thing took effect. But nevertheless, they were probably on board. The Chinese went crazy, and they said this is a complete refutation of our relationship. This is a betrayal, and we want you people in the war. And if you don't do it, this will come to haunt you forever. And they had a powerful diplomatic lobby in Washington. Chiang Kai-shek and Madam Chiang sent telegrams to everybody they knew. They leaked to the press in Washington that we were appeasing the Japanese. And Dr. T.V. Sung, Madam Chiang's brother, went to see Stimson and explained to him what a betrayal this was. And the note they sent back to Cordell Hull was the following: if there's any relaxation of the embargo or freezing regulations or belief of that gains ground, Chinese will consider that China has been completely sacrificed by the United States. The entire people would collapse, so on and so forth, lose faith in democracy. I don't know how much democracy there was in China. I don't think very much. But nevertheless, he said the Chinese army will collapse, and in the future, America would, if they came to our rescue, the situation would already be hopeless, and then the threat, such a loss would not be to China alone. And you can see where this document can be found. Well, Cordell Hull went into a panic. He thought, I can't possibly refute the Chinese. He couldn't seem to separate what was in the interest of the United States, where he was Secretary of State, with the desires of a so-called ally. So he decided that he couldn't use this note that was on the verge of being agreed. He had to use something else. Well, the something else was a memorandum that had been prepared that laid out the longer term goals for the Far East. It envisioned that Japan would withdraw from all of Indochina. It would withdraw from all of China. It would recognize the government of Chiang Kai-shek. They would revoke their membership in the tripartite pact. There's no mention of oil. Hull thought, well, I've got to give him something else, so I'll give him this memorandum. Roosevelt had been involved in the first memorandum, and so Hull had to somehow float that past Roosevelt. He wrote up, with the help of his advisors, which included Alger Hiss, a one-page memorandum, which is also in our foreign relations documents, a one-page memorandum, which essentially said, well, I'd like to use something which was a bit broader in scope than just this more narrow one before. And I'd like, if it's okay with you, I'll substitute that. His copy of that document says at the bottom, verbally agreed to by the president. There's no knowledge that I have seen, and I'm not, to my knowledge, nobody else has seen, whether he went to see Roosevelt, whether he phoned him on, called him on the phone and read it, or there's no indication that Roosevelt ever actually read that one page. But nevertheless, Hull had a verbal agreement from Roosevelt. This was November 25th, and by coincidence, on that same day, the Japanese armed forces had to take measures so that if diplomacy fell through, their fleets were already underway. There were 3 fleets that sailed south that were going to invade Malaya, the northern island of the Philippines, and Guam. Yamamoto's carrier fleet was on its way east, and the commander of the carrier fleet was this guy, Nagumo, who was opposed to the attack from the very beginning. He was part of the group that said, this is far too risky. Nobody's ever done anything like this before. You'll have to have underway replenishment in stormy weather in the North Pacific. Nobody has done underway replenishment like this. When you get to Pearl Harbor, you'll be opposed by land-based planes, US carrier planes, and anti-aircraft on the island of Oahu itself. The whole thing is a crazy idea, and it's going to fail. And in addition to that, you'll get several carriers sunk. This was the guy that was put in charge of the fleet, not by Yamamoto, but by the Navy Ministry of Japan, the more senior admirals, the Navy minister, so forth. And it was all done on the basis of seniority. Nagumo had no background in aviation, but nevertheless, because he had been a vice admiral since 1939, and he was the next senior vice admiral, and he was the guy that they gave the job to. So they're steaming across the North Pacific. The 26th of November, the diplomats come in. These diplomats, the same group, comes in to see Cordell Hull, and Cordell Hull hands them the 10-point note, and they are shocked. This had nothing to do with anything they had discussed before. and they said, we can't possibly accept this. This is just coming out of the blue. We've been discussing completely other things for months. Now, how can you possibly show us this? Cordell Hull says, that's our position, take it or leave it. They try to renegotiate. Hull says no. The Japanese said, all right, we want to see Roosevelt tomorrow. We'll talk with him about it. They said, okay, you can have a meeting with Roosevelt. That meeting is set for December the 27th, the next day. The morning of the 27th, Roosevelt gets the news that an amphibious force had been sighted heading south past Shanghai. This was the amphibious force that was going to invade Malaya unless it was called back. Roosevelt went crazy, and he said he realized he thought that he had been dealing with duplicitous diplomats. Everything they said to him was misleading. He had no confidence in what they were saying, and while they were talking, the armed forces of Japan were preparing another invasion. So when the Japanese diplomats walked in, he was furious and he let them have it. And as the story goes, even from a wheelchair, he could be bombastic when he was angry. There was no discussion of the 10-point note, and the Japanese diplomats were dismissed. They sent the note back to Tokyo, and the Japanese government there was in shock. And they said, what are we going to do? They had a meeting of the Imperial Council, and they considered the whole thing. There were even some people on the council that thought that they should accept it because they were going to get out of Indochina. They were going to get out of China anyway because it was a terrible quagmire. The sticking point was Manchuria, and they weren't sure whether getting out of all of China meant that Manchuria was included in that. So that was a sticking point. In addition to that, they were insulted by comments about getting out of the tripartite pact and recognizing Chiang Kai-shek. And besides all that, there was no mention of resuming oil shipments. Prince Kanoi was there as a retired prime minister, and he said, look, let's accept it with a stipulation that further negotiations are necessary. That was considered, and in the end, the council decided that the time frame for diplomatic relationships, diplomatic solutions had passed, and the efforts to achieve a diplomatic solution had failed. The code word that was to go out to Admiral Nagumo, if he was to proceed with the attack, was climb Mount Niitaka. If he was out there, and they were still hoping that diplomacy would succeed. He had to get that phrase, climb Mount Niitaka, or he was to reverse course and go back to Japan. December the 2nd, the word goes out, climb Mount Niitaka. So there's no more doubt, they're on their way. And this is their course. December the 2nd, they're about here. December the 3rd, they change course, they head southeast. December the 4th, they're in here. December the 5th, they're refueling. Here's a force of 6 carriers, 2 battleships, 2 cruisers, 2 submarines, a squadron of destroyers, and 8 tankers. The 8 tankers, after the refueling, are left behind, and the carriers and the other ships do a high-speed, steaming high-speed straight south. Also on December 5th, here is the Arizona coming in. It's a Friday afternoon. It's a beautiful day in Hawaii. This is a photograph I took of a print that's in the postgraduate center in Monterey, California. These are light reflections, imperfections in my photograph. But nevertheless, here's a tugboat bringing Arizona alongside these keys. There must be a mooring line over because they've got the jack up. There's about 15 line handlers on the quay. I would think you only need 2 or 3, but nevertheless, there they are. And here is the 2-star flag of Rear Admiral Isaac Kidd, commander of Battleship Division 1. Here is the Nevada, and here is the Tennessee, and outboard from the Tennessee is the West Virginia. That's December the 5th. December the 6th, the carriers are steaming full steam. December 7th comes, and at 0300 in the morning, a minesweeper outside the harbor picks up what they think is a midget submarine. They signal the duty destroyer outside the harbor. We think we've seen a midget submarine. The destroyer Ward is looking around, spends 2 hours searching. He can't find any trace of anything that looks like a submarine. First light comes. The Japanese start launching their planes. They're heading into heavy swells. They're taking huge thrusts in their bows. They're taking spray over the flight deck. And if this had been a practice drill, it probably would have been postponed, but there was going to be no postponement today. The air officer had to time the upward thrust of a bow for the takeoff of a plane, and they did that one by one, starting with first light on December 7th. 189 planes took off from 6 carriers, formed up, who were heading for Pearl Harbor. About the same time as the launch started, first light, a PBY patrol plane then sees the midget submarine, drops a flare over the submarine. The Ward then sees the submarine, opens fire on the submarine, and sinks it. It then decides that it's got to send a crypto message to the commandant of the 14th Naval District. It takes 20 minutes to encrypt a message. They send that to the 14th Naval District duty officer. Say it's by 6 o'clock by now. It takes him 20 minutes to decrypt it. He sends the message over to the duty officer of Pacific Fleet Command, and the Pacific Fleet duty officer is trying to get hold of Admiral Kimmel. Meanwhile, by this time, it's after 7 o'clock. The Japanese planes approach Oahu, and what they see when they go over the crest is complete silence. There's not a sign of life, let alone any defenders. They have achieved complete surprise. And the message goes back, Tora, 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 which means, the Ra means torpedo planes. The plan was, if they achieved surprise, the torpedo planes would go in first and drop their torpedoes, and the dive bombers and the fighters would strafe and bomb planes on the ground. If surprise were not achieved, the torpedo planes would be held back, and the Zeros would fight defending fighters, and the other planes would blow up anti-aircraft batteries and so forth. So when the word went out, Tora, 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 the Ra meant back to Nagumo. Complete surprise has been achieved after 3,700 miles of crossing the Pacific. And with the low frequency radios on Akagi, the word goes back to Yamamoto on the inland sea of Japan. Now, here are the ships. Here's Arizona. Here's Nevada ahead of it. Here is Tennessee and West Virginia. Here's Maryland and Oklahoma. And down here is California. Here's the dry dock with Pennsylvania, flagship of the Pacific Fleet, in a dry dock which is flooded with two destroyers in the same dry dock. The torpedoes are fitted with fins so that they don't dive deeply in the shallow water, the comparatively shallow waters of Pearl Harbor. And to do that, they have to come in low. So they come in skimming here. There are cruisers this is the naval base of Pearl Harbor. They're skimming, they're coming in so low that they have to avoid the mass of the ship, of the cruisers in the Navy base. They start dropping torpedoes. And here you see, here's Arizona outboard with a repair ship outboard. Here's Nevada. Here's Tennessee, West Virginia, Maryland, Oklahoma. And you see here a blast wave coming out, perhaps from Oklahoma here. And there's a spot here, which could be, some people think, is a midget submarine firing its torpedo. We know that at least 2 midget submarines got inside the harbor. Here's another ship sinking. You can see the water up above deck, up to the turrets. Here's another ship sinking. Navy boats trying to fend flaming oil, which is spread out from Arizona, was floating towards other ships. Within a few minutes, California was sunk. West Virginia was sunk. But they were able to achieve counter flooding. There were 3 torpedoes hit Oklahoma. There was no time to even declare general quarters or Z, and so Oklahoma capsized. Here's a picture later in the battle. Here's anti-aircraft fire, and all of those tracers are coming from ships that were manning their anti-aircraft guns. As far as we know, in all respect to the Army, they had 6 anti-aircraft positions around Pearl Harbor. Only one of them was manned, and that had no ready ammunition. They were responsible for the defense of the harbor. So all of this bursts, anti-aircraft bursts, are Navy bursts. Here's the Pennsylvania in dry dock. Here's the Cassin capsized over against Downs. There were many examples of heroic actions. Men did what they could to help wounded. Gunner's Mate Jackson Farris ordered counter flooding that kept the ship from capsizing on the California. He organized a work party to haul ammunition by hand to the gun mounts. And for that, he was awarded Medal of Honor. There were other sailors that carried out similar heroic acts. There was another one that was awarded Medal of Honor posthumously, but he didn't leave the ship even after it was sinking. The word went back to Washington. Air raid Pearl Harbor, this is no drill. And at first there was disbelief. They thought, no, this can't be Pearl Harbor, they must mean the Philippines. Well, additional reports came in Yes, it is Pearl Harbor. So they're in a matter of pandemonium in their meetings. Finally, they leave, and Roosevelt sits down with his secretary, and he dictates the Day of Infamy note that he will deliver the next day before Congress. Here he is. This would be him right here, standing in front of the Vice President, Speaker of the House. This would be Roosevelt delivering the Day of Infamy speech. Congress votes almost unanimously for war, and war exists from that moment on between Japan and the United States. So I'm willing to take your questions.
Dale, thank you very much. We'll keep it open. I believe I see a couple clapping hands, but if you want to ask a question, Mr. Jenkins, please just take the microphone and unmute yourself and ask the question. Just try to do it one at a time.
Mr. Jenkins,
Yeah,
what exact role did Hirohito play in this? Was he really was he a figurehead? Did he have more input than is generally accepted now? Less? What was his exact role?
well, he was in a passive role. He had total command of the government if he chose to exert it. He invariably chose not to exert it. And one of the things he was concerned about was there could be a coup against him by the army. The army was very much in control. And I should add about the government there, all the ministers in the government were, even though appointed by the prime minister, they were deemed to have been appointed by the emperor, so that a prime minister could not just fire a minister. The whole cabinet had to resign, and then a new cabinet would be formed without the minister that they wanted to get rid of, that the prime minister wanted to get rid of. If a minister resigned, it meant that the government had fallen, which meant that if the army minister resigned, there was no government. And that was the real power in the government. If the army minister was not present, there was no government. And so there was no government for Hirohito to exert power over. So he really, by tradition, he did not exert himself, and in reality, even without the threat of a coup, he had no real command of the government because the army minister could resign, and that would mean there wasn't a government.
So theoretically, he could not have stopped it.
I don't think so.
Thank you.
This is Captain Walt Steiner. Question, Mr. Jenkins.
Yeah.
How strong?
Please.
Thank you. Okay, Dale. How strong was that tripartite alliance between Germany, Italy, and Japan? And in terms of other readings, the Germans were pretty dismissive, well, the Nazi regime was pretty dismissive of the Japanese. And perhaps Hitler did not want to go to war with the United States in an alliance at that point. Can you comment on that further?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, because some of the more knowledgeable people, like Ambassador Caruso, thought it was a mistake to get involved with Japan with the tripartite pact. Admiral Yamamoto also thought it was a mistake. They went into it, as I mentioned, because they felt they needed some sort of bulwark against Russia. You know, in the Manchuria area, the Russians had a big Siberian army, which could potentially invade. Now, the problem the Japanese ran into is that step by step, Germany was less able to exert any power to assist them. Hitler had made the mistake of not capturing the British army, the French army at Dunkirk. He had lost the Battle of Britain. He failed to invade Britain. So then in 1941, he attacked Russia. And by the time, even though he was carving, 100 miles a day, in the beginning, they were moving into Russia, tanks, blitzkrieg, the whole bit. But they were stopped short of Moscow, 100 miles short of Moscow. And by November, when the Russian winter was closing in and they were getting nowhere, it was pretty clear that Germany was not going to be of any assistance to Japan. And Japan, nevertheless, went ahead with the attack on Pearl Harbor for all the reasons that we talked about. So the tripartite pact never really did Japan any good at all. And when they were in negotiation with Cordell Hull, one of the real sticking points was that here was Caruso negotiating with him, and all Cordell Hull had to do was pull up a picture of Caruso standing next to Hitler. It was a real negative from that point of view also. I don't know if that's a good answer to your question, but these are the facts as I see them coming into play.
Thank you. It's the intersection of timing, I think, yes. And I want to compliment you on the silk screen behind you. It's
On the what?
quite beautiful. The silk screen, the screen you have behind you.
Oh, okay. That's one, we got that in New York through a dealer that travels to Japan. We have another one on the other side of the room that we actually got in Kyoto, Japan about 5 years ago.
Very nice.
It's
Thank you.
Scroll. And we have a couple of others here also.
Mr.
Other
Hi,
Jenkins,
questions?
this is Joe Valenta. I've got a question for him.
Joe?
Yeah, nice job on that history. It's that part of it's often overlooked when we hear all about Pearl Harbor. We were talking a little bit before you started to talk about the fact that they didn't get the dry dock, and as we know that the ships were repaired and a lot of them returned to service. After the war, did we ever uncover any of the reasons why that was overlooked, how that happened?
Yes, I left an important thing out. I was trying to do this without consulting notes. There was an important thing left out here. After the end of the first attack, the morning attack, the reports went back to Akagi, the Japanese carrier, and also were transmitted almost immediately to Yamamoto. Yamamoto at his headquarters looked at all this. He was just a guy with incredible intuition. His staff around him was celebrating with the success of the first attack. He looked, as the story is told, he looked at his staff officer and he said, Admiral Nagumo is going to withdraw. Back on Akagi, Nagumo looks at his staff officer and he says, we've carried out a devastating attack. We've lost very few planes. There have been no attack against our carriers. As far as I'm concerned, this attack has been a success. The planes that were on the carrier decks ready for the afternoon attack were taken below to the hangar decks, and the Guma ordered a course back to Japan.
Okay, that pretty well describes it then. In other words, if they'd have done that second attack, it would have been against the ground facilities there, a lot of it, huh?
Other ships,
Yeah,
they were planning to be there for 2 days.
boy,
They brought the battleships in for shore bombardment. That was the total plan, and it never happened.
boy, that's interesting. Thank you.
Mr. Jenkins?
Yes, Dale.
Dale, it's Louis Leotti again. I was just interested in your sidebar before about the tripartite attack, pardon me, pact. Why is it that Hitler would then, if he was in such straits in December 41, that he would then unilaterally declare war on the United States,
Well,
thereby ensuring that he would be fighting on a two-front and really mobilizing the United States? Why would what's the thinking
well,
behind that?
you'd have to get into the psychology of Hitler. It was clearly a massive mistake. He said, Japan has not been defeated in a war in 400 years, whatever it was. We're together with a powerful ally, and together we will defeat the United States.
Okay.
It was a massive mistake on his part. Now, there's another aspect to this which is interesting. Roosevelt had said, we're not going to go against just Japan. That's not the war we want to fight. Our major opponent is Germany. So he had said, if there's a war with Japan, there's also going to be a war with Germany. Whether he would have done that after this massive attack on Pearl Harbor, we just don't know. But those were the factors in play at the time.
Thank you.
Dale, I'm sorry. Okay, do you have any insights on why the carriers were out to sea and the Naval Intelligence read, which has been very controversial, did not forecast the Japanese attack?
Well, as far as forecasting the attack, they left their radio operators, which is just all Morse code in those days. They left those guys behind in Tokyo and brought new radio operators on board, and the radio operators left behind kept a chapter. But experienced operators can pick up the idiosyncrasies of another operator, almost like it was handwriting. Operators left back in Japan, it looked like the carriers were still back there. They were complete radio silence all the way across. The radios, they transmitted nothing. Their radios were actually dismantled. They could receive but send out nothing. What could you say? I mean, they went across the North Pacific Ocean completely undiscovered.
Dale, I do want to thank you very much for your presentation tonight. I'm not going to shut down the questioning. I'm just going to shut down the recording. I do thank you very much for your insights. You opened my eyes to things I had not heard before. And your way to tie the entire loop together in Japan's involvement in from the beginning is absolutely fantastic. So thank you very much. And I'm just going to stop the recording. If there's any more questions, please continue. Thank you again, Dale.